Dave Coulier made America laugh every Friday night for 8 seasons. From 1987 to 1995, he was Joey Gladstone, the addict comic who could perform 40 voices before breakfast and make a full studio audience laugh uncontrollably with only 3 sentences. Cut it out. He created one of the most cherished comedic characters in American television history, earning a spot in the hearts and living rooms of a whole generation. Beneath that legacy of laughing, however, is a narrative that is not glamorous, but tragic in a way that nearly no one anticipated. Dave Coulier battled 2 distinct, unrelated cancers over the course of 15 months, from November 2024 to February 2026, lymphoma in stage 3. The first cancer disappeared a few days after the celebration. An altogether different cancer was the second diagnosis. A completely other battle. The physicians called him back while he was still grinning after the initial triumph. He had to start over. This is the paradox that characterizes 66-year-old Dave Coulier. The man who made everyone laugh quietly battled for his life in hospital hallways for more than a year before leaving. Both malignancies have disappeared. He performed backstage at a nostalgia event yesterday alongside Jodie Sweetin and John Stamos. That isn't a metaphor. In actuality, it is what took place. If you've ever laughed or experienced the warmth of a family that wasn't your own but seemed to be, it's Dave Coulier, a guy who battled cancer twice before returning to dance. As a tribute to one of the most quietly resilient guys in American television history, hit like right now, and it's amazing. The fact that the story of this resilience starts with a childhood in Michigan that taught him everything he would need to overcome it, rather than with the illness that attempted to stop him, is nearly unfathomable. When Dave Coulier entered the convention stage in Orlando, Florida yesterday, the audience stood up to greet him. Nor out of duty, nor out of pure nostalgia, but out of something more like relief. When someone you are terrified of losing unexpectedly appears in front of you, entire, present, and real, there is a special sense of relief. He was there alongside Andrea Barber, Lori Laughlin, Jodie Sweetin, and John Stamos. The largest reunion of the original Full House actors since Bob Saget's death in January 2022. At the center of it all was Dave Coulier, the guy who had spent 15 months hopping between radiation tables, chemotherapy chairs, and hospital waiting rooms, laughing and dancing while conveying the message he had traveled across the nation to deliver. It was NostalgiaCon, August 8, 2026, was the date, and seeing Dave Coulier on that stage was more than just heartwarming to anyone who had followed the silent, arduous tale of what he had gone through over the previous 14 months. It was astounding. He had no assurance that he would ever reach the stage in Orlando. The video was uploaded on TikTok by John Stamos. In a matter of hours, had spread throughout every platform with the particular speed that only true emotion can produce, with Coulier, Sweetin, and Stamos laughing together on stage. Not a celebrity spectacle, but something more subdued and challenging to identify. The realization that what you were witnessing was a man who had received something back that had actually been in danger of being taken. Coulier then shared with the audience what the physicians had informed him. He told them how wonderful he felt. The scans were clean. He informed them, and because everything that has happened to Dave Coulier over the past 15 months has molded him into the person he is at 66. He shared with them the sole reason he had traveled to Orlando. Early detection is crucial. Consult your physicians. Get examined. Take as many exams as you can. The message was that. That was the goal. The man is that. However, you must go back to neither the diagnosis nor the initial chemotherapy treatment in order to fully comprehend the significance of Dave Coulier's message. As he stands on that stage, you need to go much farther back than that. You must return to a young boy in Michigan who discovered early on that the world did not give you anything and that the only path to success was to walk straight ahead. On September 21, 1959, David Allen Coulier was born in St. Clair Shores, Michigan. a working-class community near Lake St. Clair on Detroit's Eastern Fringe, where people built things by hand and judged their neighbors by how hard they worked and how little they complained. It was not a position of hereditary privilege. It was a place of earned character that molded Dave Coulier in ways that would not be fully apparent until decades later, when he was informed, for the second time in a year, that his body was battling something it had never asked to fight while sitting in an oncologist's office. Dave Coulier Sr., his father, was an executive at Ford Motor Company. The family was nurtured by his mother Carolyn, who provided the stable, grounded presence that moms in working-class Michigan households were frequently expected to provide. They weren't rich. They had no connection. They were the type of American family that valued turning up to work, fulfilling obligations, and supporting one another. And in a home where effort was the norm and quitting was just not a word, their son was taught this belief daily through example rather than instruction. Dave Coulier has a talent for making people laugh from practically the start. Not the polished, nuanced comedy of an academic who studied the trade in a workshop. Anything more spontaneous and unprocessed than that. He was the young person in the room who could read the mood in a matter of seconds and identify the one voice, the one viewpoint, and the one perfectly timed physical move that would make everyone around him burst out laughing. Even as a young child, he had an almost visceral connection to humor, as if it were something his nervous system used to process the environment rather than something he performed. He went to St. John Paul II High School, Clare Shores, where the innate sense of humor evolved into something more intentional. When he was a teenager, he started doing stand-up comedy, standing in front of grown-ups and demanding their laughter before you are old enough to have gained their respect by any standard measure is nearly daring. However, Coulier had an insight that most youngsters do not, that genuine laughter is a sign of trust and that you have reached someone in a way that very few other things can. From the start, he was connecting with people. The voices were what set him apart from the dozens of other young comedians working the venues in and around Michigan in the late 1970s. Dave Coulier had a range and precision for perceptions that was almost unnerving. Politicians, comedians, and cartoon characters. In the middle of a sentence, he could switch between registers and land each one with the assurance of someone who had spent years inhabiting that voice dot. It wasn't a practical joke. It was a craft that would ultimately take him from Michigan to a Los Angeles television studio, where everything would be different. In search of something with no assurance of success and no safety net, he relocated to Los Angeles. Stand-up work, TV auditions, the arduous, humble, and sometimes thrilling process of attempting to turn the one skill you were born with into a career. He was employed. He gave a performance. He established a subtle but genuine reputation in the comedy clubs. The reputation of someone who consistently delivered, never mailed it in, and handled a half-empty Tuesday night club with the same seriousness he would eventually bring to a 20 million-person Friday night network audience. Then Full House discovered him. Instead, he discovered Full House in the particular manner that 10 years of unrelenting, unglamorous preparation usually leads to a moment. It wasn't a miracle at the audition. It was the inevitable collision of a part that required exactly what Dave Coulier had been developing since he was a youngster in St. Clair Shores: the warmth, the voices, the physical humor, and the innate capacity to simultaneously connect with adults and children. A man who, for the better part of 10 years, had been manufacturing those identical tools without fully understanding their intended use. After a family tragedy, comedian Joey Gladstone moved into the Tanner house to assist in raising 3 kids. The man who could make 40 impressions while wearing his heart on the outside of his chest was never the coolest person in the room, but was always the friendliest. When the kids didn't need to laugh, who sat with them in the dark and made them laugh? In hindsight, Dave Coulier did not play a part in it. Dave Coulier played this role because Joey Gladstone lacked the traits that made her adored by a whole generation. Before the cameras ever rolled, St. Ed Clair had already developed these traits from a life of earning everything the hard way. What does the boy who learned to make people laugh in Michigan mean? One day, the youngster who came to Los Angeles with little but talent, self-control, and an almost unyielding resolve to give up would stand on a stage in Orlando and implore 20 million people to see their physicians using the same voice he had been honing since adolescence. Everything. It has great significance. However, the answer to that question starts in 1987. When Full House debuted, America first met Joey Gladstone. And Dave Coulier's life took a turn that no one, least of all himself, could have entirely predicted. There are times in life when everything can be neatly divided into before and after. Not gradually, not with caution, but with the unique surgical precision of a single statement uttered by a person in a white coat in a clinical setting, followed by a quiet that is unlike any other silence a human being would ever asterisk. Luke was his son. His life was full in the particular sense that it becomes full once the din of ambition has subsided. What's left is genuine. You stop taking relationships, mornings, and the everyday texture of days for granted because you're mature enough to see how rapidly things can change. Non-Hodgkin lymphoma was the diagnosis. Phase 3. A lymphatic system malignancy is called non-Hodgkin lymphoma. The human body's network of arteries and nodes that transport white blood cells and function as one of the main immune defense systems. In stage 3, the cancer has either progressed to an organ or tissue outside of the lymph nodes or to lymph nodes on both sides of the diaphragm. It's not the first stage. It's not the most recent. At this point, the illness has sufficiently established itself to warrant a severe, vigorous, long-term response. It was highly treatable, the doctor assured him. Later on, Coulier would remember those words with the unique combination of thankfulness and fear that only a cancer patient can truly comprehend. Hearing that the battle can be won is relieving, but it must be weighed against fully understanding the cost of victory. 6 cycles of Rh-CHOP chemotherapy were the recommended course of treatment. The standard treatment for aggressive non-Hodgkin lymphoma is ROP, a group of 5 drugs that cooperate to target the cancer cells from several directions at once. Rituximab, which targets a particular protein on lymphoma cell surface, cyclophosphamide, doxorubicon, prednisone with Vincent. Every cycle was administered intravenously over several hours. Days of recuperation that strain the body's reserves in ways that are hard to explain and impossible to fully prepare for follow each cycle. Months are divided into 6 cycles. A persistent attack on the illness, which is unavoidably a persistent attack on the body battling it. R-CHOP has unmistakable side effects. A person's relationship to rest is completely rewritten by exhaustion. It's a weight that creeps into the bones and doesn't go away, not fatigue from a hard day. Hair loss, nausea, and the susceptibility to a weakened immune system that makes everyday situations seem dangerous, for the most part. Dave Coulier handled everything in silence and with the same attitude that St. Clair Shores had instilled in him. Keep moving, keep your head down, and don't inflict pain on an audience that didn't ask to see it. John Stamos shaved his head after that. It wasn't a publicity stunt. It wasn't a well-planned social media event meant to spark interaction. It was a buddy, a man who had supported Dave Coulier for almost 40 years, since they were both young men negotiating the unique demands of unexpected television stardom, deciding that he would lose his hair if his pal was going to lose it due to chemotherapy. John Stamos, whose well-known full hair had been a part of his public persona for as long as the majority of his fans could recall, shaved it all the way to the scalp in unannounced solidarity, because that is what you do for someone who is fighting for his life and needs to know that he is not fighting alone. The picture went viral right away. Fans of Full House, who had grown up witnessing Joey Gladstone and Uncle Jesse navigate the lovely, chaotic warmth of the Tanner household, reacted to that image with an emotion that was hard to put into words. They were now in their 40s and 50s, had children of their own, and had their own accumulation of loss and survival. It was more than just touching. It was the acknowledgement of something genuine in a media environment that frequently finds it difficult to create. Decades of shared history bind two guys together in a meaningful way. One of them was ill, and the other wouldn't let him suffer by himself. Melissa Coulier was there the entire time. In 2014, she wed Dave in a wedding that friends said was really happy and private. The union of two individuals who had come to each other fully aware of their identities rather than rushing toward one another. She supported him during the 6 cycles, the diagnosis, the days when the treatment was working, and the days when it seemed like nothing was happening. It is rare to identify the unique bravery of the person who stands with the patient without flinching, who wakes up every morning in the same terror, and who chooses to be present every single morning. The only way it can be truly carried is if Melissa Coulier did so without complaining or performing. Dave Coulier finally got the news he had been waiting 5 months for. By April of 2025, the scans were clear. The lymphoma had disappeared. He had no cancer. He started by telling those closest to him. Then, with the special appreciation of someone who understands in a visceral and non-abstract way that the outcome may have been different, he informed the audience. He rejoiced. Naturally, he enjoyed 6 cycles of ARC-UP, 5 months of chemotherapy, the exhaustion and anxiety, and the months of not knowing for sure what the next scan would reveal. He was fully deserving of the festivities. However, the festivities were short-lived, because the physicians discovered something different while Dave Coulier was still grinning. The relief was still new, the appreciation was still fresh, and the future had just reopened in front of him like a door he had been frightened was closing. The follow-up scans had discovered something that no one had been searching for, something entirely unconnected to the lymphoma, something that had its own name, biology, treatment plan, and unique requirements for a guy who had already given his all to a battle he had already won for 5 months. Whether Dave Coulier has anything left is not the question. When the answer to that question is put to the test a second time without pausing, without pity, and without even the grace of a complete season of recuperation in between wars, the question is what a man fashioned of the particular material that St. Clair Shores creates accomplishes. No clinical language can sufficiently describe the timing's unique cruelty. Everything had been done correctly by Dave Coulier. He had complied with one of the most rigorous chemotherapy regimens in contemporary oncology for 6 cycles. Even on the days when trust was the most difficult thing to uphold, he had come up for every session, put up with every side effect, and trusted the physicians, the medication, and the procedure. He had witnessed his friend John Stamos shave his head in solidarity, and he took away from that act the unique support that only true human connection can offer in the deepest recesses of a life-threatening illness. He had clung to Melissa. He had clung to Luke, with the unique obstinacy of a man brought up in a Michigan home where forward was the only option. He had continued to move forward, and it had been successful. April 2025. Clear scans, no signs of lymphoma, no cancer. Relief after a cancer diagnosis is not a straightforward feeling. It is intricate, multi-layered, and filled with a thankfulness that is nearly identical to pain. The sorrow of really realizing, without abstraction, how similar the alternative result had been. For 5 months, Dave Coulier had lived inside that comprehension. Every morning when he woke up and every night when he went to bed, he had felt the burden of it. Abruptly, the weight vanished. It was an open future. The scans were clear. He was 65 years old and clear of cancer. And all the world wanted was for him to enjoy it, with his wife, his kid, and the tiny group of individuals who had been there throughout the months. When public performance was the last thing on his mind, he quietly celebrated in the manner of a guy who has never been drawn to public performance of private emotion. It wasn't a big gesture. It was worth more than that asterisk. It was just a typical feel of life returning to normal. Meals, breakfast, the simple joy of a day that doesn't start with a blood test, a therapy visit, or a discussion about the newest statistics. The phone called a few days later. The follow-up scans, the regular monitoring that oncology protocols require even after an all-clear. The meticulous surveillance that good medicine maintains, precisely because the body does not always announce its complications in advance, had discovered something that was not lymphoma. Not a recurrence of what had already been treated and defeated, but something different. Something that existed in an entirely different biological category from the cancer he had just defeated. Something that the lymphoma had nothing to do with, had not caused, and had not predicted. When the diagnosis was made, it was P16 squamous cell carcinoma, specifically oropharyngeal squamous cell carcinoma of the base of the tongue. This disease is often linked to the human papillomavirus and has a biology and progression completely different from non-Hodgkin lymphoma. It arrived as a completely independent second front in a war that Dave Coulier had not declared, had not chosen, and had not yet fully recovered from. Later on, he would relate the second diagnosis with a directness that was more powerful than any dramatization could have. Did this happen because of the lymphoma? He asked the physicians, trying to make sense of the relationship. In order to make the sequence understandable and give the cruelty of the time some sort of logical structure, you need a logic, a causal thread between the first cancer and the second. Completely unrelated, the physicians informed him that it is hard to overestimate the significance of these two words. Not a metastasis, not a recurrence, not a side effect of chemotherapy, and not a result of the immunological suppression that comes with rigorous cancer treatment. In the little period between the conclusion of one battle and the start of whatever was anticipated to follow, a second distinct, physiologically unrelated malignancy appeared. He posed the appropriate queries. He paid attention to the medical professionals. Then he started over. P16 oropharyngeal squamous cell cancer therapy. There is a 90% or greater cure rate when caught at the stage where Coulier was captured, which is exactly the argument he would later apply to every stage, camera, and convention panel he could find. When radiation is applied regularly and accurately, the disease responds to it. The result is not assured. By the standards of oncology, this is a truly excellent prognosis for a patient whose cancer has been discovered before it has had a chance to progress beyond the reach of treatment. However, medicine does not deal in guarantees. Starting in the months after the second diagnosis, 35 sessions of targeted radiation therapy were administered with the focused precision made possible by contemporary radiation oncology, aimed at the precise location of the illness with precision intended to enhance the effect on the cancer and reduce the collateral damage to the surrounding tissue. 35 sessions, each one a tiny act of self-discipline, each one another morning of showing up for the fight, even when it was the most difficult thing to do. New Year's Eve, December 31st, 2025, marked the end of the radiation. On the final day of the year, Dave Coulier battled two entirely different cancers, underwent 35 radiation sessions and 6 cycles of chemotherapy, witnessed his closest friends shave their heads in solidarity, relied on his wife and son, and the accumulated strength of a life based on the belief that there is only one direction forward had not stopped, had not given up, and had not diminished his sense of satisfaction as a man. On the final day of 2025 and the first hours of 2026, he left the radiation facility, and the question that had loomed over 15 months of struggle was finally within grasp. The story would be revealed by the scans. After the physicians read the results, 66-year-old Dave Coulier, who had been diagnosed twice, treated twice, and was still alive, would wait in the unique silence that follows a fight before the verdict was announced to find out what his life's next chapter would entail. For those who had been silently following Dave Coulier's tale throughout the arduous months of therapy, February 4th, 2026 started off like any other morning, a morning like the ones that had come before it, with the particular low-grade tension of waiting that, during a serious illness, becomes so familiar that it nearly ceases to register as tension and starts to feel like the weather. the state in which a person's life is suspended between what has occurred and what is about to be verified. Then came the confirmation, the follow-up scans, the thorough imaging required by oncology following the conclusion of a full course of therapy, and the ultimate accounting of what the medication had accomplished and what the disease had left behind. Came back clear. Both malignancies have disappeared. 6 cycles of R-CHOP chemotherapy were used to treat stage 3 non-Hodgkin lymphoma, which was in remission. 35 targeted radiation sessions were used to treat P16 oropharyngeal squamous cell cancer, which is currently in remission. 2 separate diagnoses, 2 separate treatment plans, 2 separate triumphs. One 66-year-old guy entered the toughest 15 months of his life and emerged with clear scans and a mission that had not existed before to the sickness. The formal announcement was made on May 9, 2026, when Dave Coulier made an appearance on Good Morning America, which for decades has been the public square of American morning life, where the nation considers it shared news over coffee and the unique vulnerability of early morning attention. The words that everyone who had been following his trip had been wanting to hear were delivered by him as he sat in that studio. "Both of my cancers are in remission, Doc, and what a journey this has been." The phrasing simplicity is what gives it its full impact. Not a well-crafted remark crafted by a PR, it's not a relief performance designed to evoke the strongest feelings possible. Just the words of a man who had been asked a question and was responding to it in the same straightforward and unadorned manner that had defined every aspect of his behavior over the previous 15 months. It had been a journey, and he was in remission from both cancers. His description of it as a roller coaster ride is so well known that it runs the risk of going unnoticed. However, the term regains its full significance when used by a man who has really experienced the exact sequence that Dave Coulier did. The cancer diagnosis, the 6 chemotherapy cycles, the April all clear, the joyous days, and the second diagnosis unrelated and unanticipated arriving in the space between one triumph and what was meant to happen next. The final day of treatment on New Year's Eve, the 35 radiation sessions, and the somber, unglamorous, incredibly human sensation of waiting for proof that the battle was indeed over, a roller coaster. Indeed, just that. The particular vocabulary of a man who is merely trying to describe as accurately as possible how the experience felt on the inside rather than aiming for poetry. However, Dave Coulier did more than just declare his own recuperation on Good Morning America that morning. With millions of people watching over breakfast, he made use of the platform. The impact of a morning show that reaches homes in every region and demographic of American society. To say something that had grown to be his most significant knowledge during the last 15 months. He acknowledged that he had never desired to be the cancer poster boy, since most individuals in his position would feel this way in private, and few would express it in public. The term struck a particularly honest chord. A public sickness carries a certain type of pressure. It is anticipated that the diagnosed individual will take on the role of ambassador, turn their pain into advocacy, and identify the significance in the experience, and share it with an audience that is more interested in the meaning than the intricacy. Dave Coulier recognized that pressure and gave it a name. He had not requested this position, but he accepted it nonetheless because he was unwilling to use the alternative of having access to a platform that could reach people who had not yet spoken to their doctors, who had not yet scheduled the prostate exam, the mammogram, or the routine screening that might catch something early enough to matter. Examine your prostate. Obtain those mammograms. Consult your physicians. Go ahead and do this. The vocabulary is simple. They don't require clinical terminology to deliver or medical knowledge to comprehend. These are the words of a man who has been on the other side of early detection, whose P16 squamous cell carcinoma was discovered at a stage where the cure rate surpasses 90% because of careful monitoring, regular follow-up, and the opportunity for medication to do what it does when it is given the chance to work before the disease has spread beyond its reach, speaking on behalf of a cause that a publicist has given him is not what Dave Coulier is doing as a celebrity. He is speaking from the perspective of a patient who is intimately aware of the distinction between early and late detection in the lived experience of a human body and life. That type of authority is distinct. It is the authority of someone who has earned the right to speak after 15 months of radiation tables, chemotherapy chairs, and spotless scans, as well as the unique, indescribable relief of hearing those words in remission applied to 2 different fights that he had no assurance of winning. Additionally, every Full House story that has been told since January 2022 has a shadow at its periphery. Danny Tanner, played by Bob Saget, was not only Dave Coulier's co-star for 8 seasons, but also his best friend in the unique and irreplaceable sense that a shared formative experience fosters a connection that cannot be created or duplicated. On January 23, 2022, Bob Saget passed away in his Orlando hotel room at the age of 65. Yesterday, the cast came together to commemorate Coulier's survival. The morning following a performance, he was discovered. He was 65. On August 8, 2026, Dave Coulier stood in Orlando at the age of 66, 1 year older than his best friend had ever reached. The Full House family was affected by Bob Saget's passing in a way that has not yet entirely healed and most likely never will. Some losses just become a permanent part of the persons who bear them because they do not go away. It is carried by Dave Coulier. It is carried by John Stamos. It is carried by Jodie Sweetin. Every reunion panel and get-together of people who worked together to create something and then lost one of the builders before it was completed is filled with pain. Orlando had it. It will never go away. However, Dave Coulier is also there. That is what August 8, 2026 demands. He's here. Standing on a stage in Orlando alongside his loved ones, he is 66 years old, in remission from 2 cancers, and sharing the message that the illness given him. He is present. And the last chapter of this novel is designed to address the question of what that presence means, what it costs, what it signifies, and what it demands of everyone who watches. Before the audience, before the panel, and before Dave Coulier would stand at a microphone in Orlando yesterday morning and say the words he had traveled across the nation to say. A video was uploaded on TikTok by John Stamos. The content was not manufactured. It wasn't a meticulously lit commercial video put together by a group of individuals whose job it is to make famous people appear impulsive. It was filmed from backstage. Coulier, Stamos, and Jodie Sweetin are moving together in the carefree, effortless manner of people who have known each other for 40 years and have long since